A double tap ruined my life. I shouldn't have opened Instagram at 2 a.m., but insomnia had become my unwelcome companion since the breakup. There it was. My ex Mason's story. Him kissing someone else against a neon-lit wall downtown. The guy was absolutely gorgeous. All sharp cheekbones and silver hair that caught the city lights like mercury. And the caption read, "Finally found my person." My chest felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything vital and left me empty. 3 weeks ago, Mason was crying outside my apartment building, mascara-streaked cheeks and trembling hands as he begged for another chance. "I can't do this without you, Dennis," he'd sobbed into my shoulder. "You're everything to me." Now he was posting couple photos like our 2-year relationship had been nothing more than a rough draft for his real love story. I screenshot the story before I could stop myself, then immediately felt pathetic for documenting my own heartbreak. The logical part of my brain whispered that I should delete the app, block him, move on like a mature adult, but my thumb kept scrolling, each swipe another small act of self-destruction. "Dennis, you're stalking him again," my conscience murmured, but I was already too deep in the rabbit hole. More photos followed in rapid succession. Mason and this mystery silver-haired stranger at coffee shops, art galleries, the indie bookstore on 5th Street, the same places he used to take me when we were happy. Each image was perfectly curated to showcase their blissful new romance. How Mason had apparently upgraded from boring, predictable me to this stunning, ethereal creature who looked like he'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. The worst part wasn't even the photos themselves. It was how genuine Mason's smile looked. During our last months together, his expressions had been forced, mechanical, like he was going through the motions of loving me. But in these pictures, his eyes sparkled with an authenticity I hadn't seen in forever. The stranger had managed to bring back the Mason I'd fallen for in college. The one who used to write terrible poetry and leave surprise notes in my textbooks. My phone buzzed with a notification that made my stomach lurch. A direct message. "I saw you viewed my story. Hope you're doing okay." Heat flooded my face like I'd been caught committing a crime. He knew I was watching, probably planned it that way. Mason had always been calculating when he wanted something. Could read people like open books and push exactly the right buttons to get the desired reaction. I should have known better than to fall into his trap, but apparently heartbreak had made me sloppy. I typed and deleted a dozen responses, each one more pathetic than the last. "I miss you." Delete. "Who is he?" Delete. "Please come back." Delete. 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 Finally, I settled on something that felt appropriately distant. "Living my best life. Thanks." 3 dots appeared immediately beneath my message. He was typing back in real time, probably sitting in bed next to his new boyfriend, crafting the perfect response to twist the knife a little deeper. "Good to hear. By the way, we'll probably run into each other soon. Jaxon wants to check out that bookstore you recommended, Pages and Poetry on 5th Street. Jaxon. So that was the silver-haired god's name. And Mason was planning to bring him to my sanctuary, the bookstore where we'd had our first official date 2 years ago. The place where Mason had nervously asked if he could hold my hand while we browsed the poetry section, where he'd bought me a first-edition copy of Neruda's love sonnets that I still kept on my nightstand like a masochistic shrine to better times. The manipulation was so obvious it made my stomach churn. But it was working. I could already picture them wandering through the narrow aisles between towering bookshelves, Mason whispering sweet nothings into Jaxon's ear, maybe even recreating moments from our relationship with surgical precision. Would he show Jaxon the corner where we'd shared our first kiss? Would he buy him poetry books and pretend those gestures were original? My hands were shaking as I set the phone down on my nightstand. Screen down so I wouldn't be tempted to check for more messages. This wasn't just about moving on. This was psychological warfare. And Mason was playing to win. He knew exactly how to hurt me. Knew that seeing him happy with someone else would feel like watching my replacement live the life I thought was mine. I stared at the ceiling of my small studio apartment, counting water stains and trying to breathe through the tightness in my chest. The rational part of my brain understood that relationships end, that people move on, that I didn't own Mason or his happiness. But the wounded, petty part of me wanted to show up at that bookstore tomorrow and prove that I was fine, that his little mind game hadn't worked. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay there replaying every moment of our relationship, analyzing where things went wrong, wondering if I could have fought harder to keep him. Mason had always been dramatic, prone to grand gestures and emotional manipulation when he didn't get his way. Breaking up with him had felt like escaping a beautiful prison, exhausting but necessary for my sanity. But seeing him with Jaxon brought back all the good memories I'd been trying to suppress. Late-night conversations about literature and life, the way he'd trace patterns on my skin while we watched old movies, how he'd surprise me with my favorite coffee when I was stressed about finals. For a while, we'd been genuinely happy, before his insecurities and need for constant validation started suffocating us both. By 4 a.m., I'd made a decision that probably wasn't healthy but felt inevitable. I was going to that bookstore, not because I wanted Mason back, that ship had sailed and sunk, but because I needed to see for myself what I was supposedly missing. Maybe witnessing their happiness in person would finally give me the closure I needed to move forward. Or maybe I was just a glutton for punishment who couldn't resist picking at emotional scabs until they bled. Either way, tomorrow was going to be interesting. I grabbed my phone and set an alarm for noon, then tried to get a few hours of sleep before embarking on what would either be the beginning of my healing process or the stupidest decision I'd made since agreeing to date Mason in the first place. The last thing I remember thinking before drifting off was how Jackson's eyes had looked in that Instagram story, storm gray and intense, like he was seeing something the camera couldn't capture. Something told me there was more to Mason's new boyfriend than met the eye, and despite my better judgment, I was curious enough to find out what that something might be. After last night's Instagram spiral, I'd already made my decision. I was going to that bookstore. Consequences be damned. The next morning, I spent an embarrassing amount of time getting ready, telling myself I was just putting effort into my appearance for confidence. I changed shirts 3 times, settled on dark jeans that made my legs look longer, and even used the expensive cologne Mason had bought me for our anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on me. Getting dressed up to spy on my ex required wearing gifts from said ex. Just browsing, I told my reflection while fixing my hair for the 4th time. You're just a guy who likes books happening to visit his favorite bookstore on a Saturday afternoon. Totally normal behavior, but the truth was more complicated. I wanted to see Mason and his new boyfriend together, needed to witness their dynamic with my own eyes. Maybe it would provide the closure I'd been desperately seeking, or maybe I was just a masochist who enjoyed emotional torture. Either way, I was committed to this terrible idea. Pages and poetry looked exactly the same when I arrived around 2 p.m. Warm lighting, the smell of coffee and old paper, indie folk music playing softly in the background. But everything felt different knowing Mason and Jaxon were somewhere inside, probably creating new memories in the space where my old ones lived. I found them in the poetry section, exactly where I'd expected. Mason was holding a slim volume of contemporary verse, reading aloud in that theatrical voice he used when he wanted to impress someone. But up close, something felt off about the scene. Jaxon looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot and glancing around like he'd rather be anywhere else. When Mason reached out to touch his arm, Jaxon subtly moved away, maintaining physical distance that seemed deliberate. Interesting. Oh, Dennis. Mason's voice carried that fake cheerful tone he used when he was nervous. What a coincidence. Coincidence, my ass. But before I could respond, Jaxon looked up from the book he'd been pretending to read, and our eyes met for the first time. The pictures hadn't done him justice. He was even more striking in person, with storm gray eyes and an intensity that made me forget how to breathe properly. More importantly, when he saw me, his expression shifted to something that looked almost like relief. You must be the famous ex, Jaxon said, his voice softer than I'd expected, almost apologetic. Mason talks about you, quite a lot, actually. Mason's face went rigid. Jax, maybe we should. Actually, Jaxon interrupted, stepping closer to me and away from Mason. I was hoping to meet you. Mason mentioned you're into poetry. I am too, though I suspect we have different tastes. That was clearly a dig at Mason, whose poetry preferences ran towards simple, surface-level verse that required no deep analysis. The fact that Jaxon had already figured this out suggested he was more perceptive than Mason's usual type. The next 20 minutes were surreal. Jaxon and I fell into an easy conversation about literature while Mason grew increasingly agitated beside us. We discussed Neruda's use of imagery, debated whether modern poetry could match the classics, and discovered we both had strong opinions about pretentious MFA programs. Jaxon was funny and intelligent, with a dry sense of humor that caught me off guard. More importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say, asking follow-up questions and building on my ideas instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. It was refreshing. During the last months of our relationship, Mason had developed a habit of zoning out whenever I got passionate about something. Like my enthusiasm was an inconvenience he had to endure. "I should get your number," Jaxon said suddenly, pulling out his phone. "Maybe we can continue this conversation sometime. You know, as friends who actually enjoy discussing books." Another subtle jab at Mason, who was now practically vibrating with irritation. His jaw was clenched so tight I was surprised his teeth didn't crack. "Jax, I really don't think—" "It's fine, Mason," I said smoothly, enjoying his discomfort more than I probably should have. "I'm always happy to make new friends, especially ones with good taste in literature." Jaxon smiled. Genuinely smiled. Not the polite, practiced expression I'd seen in Mason's Instagram posts. Something warm unfurled in my chest, a feeling I hadn't experienced since before the breakup. For the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again instead of just the sad ghost of Dennis who used to exist. We exchanged numbers while Mason watched with barely concealed horror. His plan was backfiring spectacularly, and he knew it. What was supposed to be a power move showing off his upgrade while making me feel inadequate had turned into his new boyfriend bonding with his ex over shared interests that excluded him entirely. "We should probably get going," Mason said through gritted teeth, grabbing Jackson's elbow with more force than necessary. "We have dinner reservations." "Do we?" Jaxon asked mildly, not moving. "I thought we were just browsing today." The tension between them was palpable now, and I realized I was witnessing the cracks in their supposedly perfect relationship. Mason's controlling tendencies were already showing, and Jaxon didn't seem like the type to tolerate being managed. "It was really nice meeting you, Dennis," Jaxon said, ignoring Mason's increasingly frantic energy. "I'll text you about those poetry recommendations we discussed." As they walked away, I caught Jaxon glancing back at me over his shoulder, and something passed between us. An understanding, maybe, or just acknowledgement that we'd both enjoyed the conversation more than we should have. Mason was too busy sulking to notice, but I felt it like electricity in the air. I spent another hour wandering the bookstore, replaying every moment of our interaction. Jaxon wasn't what I'd expected. From Mason's Instagram posts, I'd assumed he was just another pretty face, someone shallow enough to be impressed by Mason's performative romance. But he was clearly intelligent, thoughtful, and already seeing through Mason's facade. More troubling was how natural our conversation had felt, how easily we'd connected over poetry and ideas. I hadn't felt that kind of intellectual chemistry with anyone in years. Certainly not with Mason, whose idea of deep conversation involved discussing which Netflix shows to binge-watch. By the time I left the bookstore, my phone had already buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Thanks for the book recommendations. Also, thanks for not making that as awkward as it could have been." "Jax," I stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "Thanks for being more interesting than expected. Let me know what you think of the Neruda collection." His reply came quickly. "Already ordered it." Mason seemed tense. "Sorry about that." And there it was. Acknowledgement that all was not well in paradise. Mason's jealousy had been obvious enough for his own boyfriend to notice and apologize for. I should have felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt sorry for Jaxon. He seemed too genuine to be caught up in Mason's emotional games. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much more complicated than I'd bargained for. 3 days after our bookstore encounter, Jackson's text arrived, and I was embarrassingly excited about it. "Coffee? That poetry discussion is still pending." His message was simple, but my heart did something stupid and fluttery in response. I tried to convince myself this was just friendship, but the extra care I took getting ready suggested otherwise. I changed clothes twice before settling on a soft gray sweater that brought out my eyes and jeans that fit just right. The cafe Jaxon chose was cozy and tucked away from the main street. The kind of place perfect for conversations you didn't want overheard. When I arrived, he was already there, 2 books stacked beside his laptop, fingers drumming nervously against his coffee cup. He looked up when I approached, and that same warm smile from the bookstore lit up his face. "Mason doesn't know I'm here," he admitted before I'd even sat down, stirring his latte with unnecessary intensity. "He thinks I'm at work, catching up on some freelance graphic design projects. That should have been a red flag. Secret meetings with your boyfriend's ex rarely led anywhere good." Instead, I felt flattered that he wanted to spend time with me badly enough to lie about it. "Secret coffee dates, huh?" I said, settling into the chair across from him. "I'm honored to be worth the deception." "It's not a date," Jaxon clarified quickly, though his cheeks flushed pink in a way that suggested he'd thought about it. "I just needed to talk to someone who actually understands poetry. Mason tries to be interested, but he doesn't get the deeper meanings," I finished, remembering countless conversations where Mason's eyes would glaze over when I got passionate about metaphors and symbolism. "Yeah, I know. He's more of a surface-level reader." "Exactly." Jackson's whole face lit up with relief. "When I try to explain why certain imagery works or discuss the historical context of a piece, he gets this look like I'm speaking a foreign language. Then he changes the subject to something more fun." The air quotes around "fun" told me everything I needed to know about how that made Jaxon feel. I'd been there, the slow erosion of feeling heard, the gradual realization that your interests were seen as pretentious or boring by the person who was supposed to love all of you. 3 hours disappeared like minutes. We talked about everything. Poetry led to personal stories, which led to family dynamics, career aspirations, and the kind of deep philosophical discussions I'd missed more than I realized. Jaxon was a freelance graphic designer who'd studied literature in college, but took the practical route after graduation. He still wrote poetry in his spare time, he admitted shyly, though he'd never shown it to Mason. "Why not?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "He doesn't really get it. Says my stuff is too abstract, too emotional. He prefers things that are straightforward, easy to understand." Jackson's voice got quieter. "Sometimes I feel like I'm dumbing myself down just to relate to him." My chest ached with recognition. I know that feeling. Toward the end of our relationship, I stopped talking about the things I cared about because Mason would either ignore me or make jokes to deflect. It's lonely, feeling like you can't share your real self with the person you're supposed to be closest to. "Yes." Jaxon leaned forward, eyes bright with understanding. "That's exactly it. Lonely in a relationship is somehow worse than being actually alone." We fell into comfortable silence after that, both lost in thought. I watched Jackson's hands as he absently traced patterns on his coffee cup, long fingers, neat nails, a small scar on his knuckle that made me want to ask for the story behind it. Everything about him seemed thoughtful and deliberate, from the way he chose his words to how he really listened when I spoke. "Dennis," he said softly as we prepared to leave, "can I ask you something personal?" My pulse quickened. "Shoot. Do you still love him? Mason, I mean." The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. It was complicated. I loved the version of Mason I'd fallen for. The charming, attentive guy who'd swept me off my feet during our first months together. But that person had gradually been replaced by someone manipulative and self-centered. Someone who treated relationships like competitions to be won rather than partnerships to be nurtured. "I loved who he used to be," I said carefully. "Or maybe who I thought he was. The Mason I dated toward the end wasn't someone I recognized anymore." Jaxon nodded slowly, like my answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. "He talks about you constantly. Our first few dates, every story somehow circled back to something you'd done together or said. I started to wonder if he was dating me to get over you, or if he was using me to make you jealous. And now I think it might be both." Jackson's laugh was bitter. "The bookstore thing was definitely a setup. He knew you'd probably show up if he mentioned it, knew it would hurt you to see us together in a place that meant something to you both." The confirmation of what I'd already suspected should have made me angry, but mostly I just felt sad for Jaxon, who deserved better than being used as a prop in Mason's emotional manipulation. And for Mason himself, who was apparently so insecure about our breakup that he couldn't move on without dragging both of us into his drama. "I'm sorry," I said. "You don't deserve to be caught in the middle of whatever unresolved issues Mason and I have." "Maybe not," Jaxon agreed, standing and gathering his books. But I'm not exactly innocent here either. What do you mean? He paused, looking directly into my eyes with an intensity that made my breath catch. I mean, I've been thinking about you since we met. More than I should, considering I'm supposedly in a relationship with your ex. The confession hit me like a physical force. Standing there in the cafe's warm lighting, surrounded by the low hum of other people's conversations, I realized that whatever was happening between Jaxon and me had moved far beyond friendly literary discussions. Jaxon. I know, he said quickly. I know it's complicated and probably a terrible idea, but I can't pretend I don't feel something here. Neither could I. The connection we'd discovered over books and coffee felt real in a way that my relationship with Mason never quite had, effortless and natural instead of forced and performative. What are we doing? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. I have no idea, Jaxon admitted, shouldering his bag. But I know I want to see you again. Walking back to our cars, the tension between us was thick enough to cut. We weren't just friends anymore. Hadn't been since that first moment in the bookstore when our eyes met and something clicked into place. The problem was that Jaxon was still Mason's boyfriend and I was still Mason's ex. And somewhere in the middle of all that history and hurt, we were creating something new and potentially explosive. Text me, I said when we reached my car. I will, he promised, and from the way he was looking at me, I believed him. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to either learn to fly or crash spectacularly into the rocks below. Apparently Mason had developed detective skills, because the following week he stormed into my apartment like an avenging angel with perfectly styled hair. You've been meeting behind my back. His voice was sharp enough to cut glass, dripping with venom and accusation. Jaxon stood beside him looking guilty and confused, like he'd been dragged here against his better judgment. From the tension in his shoulders and the way he avoided eye contact, it was clear Mason had forced him to come. It's not behind your back, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my racing heart. We're just friends who happen to enjoy discussing literature. Friends don't look at each other the way you two do. Mason was practically screaming now, his carefully maintained composure completely shattered. I saw the Instagram story, Jax. You tagged yourself at that same cafe where you told me you were working late. Busted by social media. The ironic twist that this whole mess had started with Instagram. And now it was Instagram that exposed our secret meetings. Jaxon had clearly made a rookie mistake by location tagging our coffee date, probably out of habit rather than malicious intent. Jaxon stepped forward, reaching tentatively for Mason's arm in a gesture that was both comforting and defensive. Mason, you're being paranoid. Paranoid? Mason jerked away from his touch like he'd been burned. My boyfriend is having secret coffee dates with my ex-boyfriend, talking about feelings and poetry and God knows what else. And you think I'm being paranoid? Maybe, I interrupted, standing up from my couch to face him properly. You should ask yourself why you're so threatened by this. If you're truly happy with Jaxon, my existence shouldn't matter to your relationship. It was absolutely the wrong thing to say. Mason's face went from pale to bright red in seconds, and I realized I'd just thrown gasoline on an already raging fire. You want to know why I'm threatened? Mason's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Because you're trying to steal him, just like you tried to control and manipulate everything when we were together. Control? Now I was getting angry, my own carefully maintained calm starting to crack. Mason, I told you to have space because you were suffocating me. You turned every conversation into an interrogation, every friendship into a threat. That's not... Stop! Jaxon finally exploded, his voice echoing off the walls of my small apartment with surprising force. Both of you, just stop this. The silence that followed was deadly, thick with tension and hurt feelings. Jaxon looked between Mason and me, his storm-gray eyes reflecting pain and disappointment, like he was seeing both of us clearly for the first time and didn't like what he was discovering. Mason, he said quietly, his voice trembling slightly with controlled emotion. You brought me into this mess specifically to make Dennis jealous. Don't act surprised when it gets complicated and messy. Mason opened his mouth to protest, probably to deny the obvious truth, but Jaxon wasn't finished. And Dennis, he turned to face me directly, his gaze intense and unflinching. Part of you is definitely using me to get back at him. I can feel it in the way you look at him when you think I'm not watching. My stomach dropped like I was falling from a great height, because he was absolutely right, at least partially. This friendship, these coffee dates, these growing feelings, they had started as a form of revenge against Mason, even if they'd evolved into something genuine and real along the way. So here's what's going to happen, Jaxon continued, his voice steadier now but tinged with sadness and exhaustion. I'm done being a pawn in whatever toxic game you two are playing. Both of you need to figure out what you actually want, each other, me, or just the drama and chaos. He walked toward my apartment door with purposeful strides, then paused with his hand on the doorknob, not quite ready to leave but clearly done with this conversation. And when you do figure it out, he said without turning around, maybe consider that I have feelings too, real ones that matter. Before the door slammed shut, I caught a glimpse of tears gathering in his eyes. The final confirmation that we'd hurt someone who didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of our unresolved issues. Mason and I stood in awkward silence afterward, both of us finally realizing that we'd wounded someone genuinely good while trying to score points against each other. The apartment felt too small suddenly, filled with the weight of accusation and guilt. Mason was still breathing hard from his outburst, running his hands through his hair in the nervous gesture I remembered from our worst fights. For a moment he looked vulnerable and young, like the college student I'd fallen in love with before everything got complicated. This is fucked up, Mason said finally, his voice smaller now. Yeah, I agreed, sinking back onto my couch. It really is. I didn't mean for. He trailed off, probably realizing that his intentions didn't matter much at this point. The damage was done. I know, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Mason had always been calculating when he felt threatened, willing to use people as weapons in his emotional wars. But seeing Jaxon's hurt had clearly shaken him. Do you actually care about him? Mason asked, sitting heavily in my desk chair. Or is this just about getting back at me? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since our first coffee date. Both, I think. It started as revenge, but somewhere along the way it became real. He's not what I expected. Mason nodded slowly, like my honesty was helping him process his own complicated feelings. He's better than both of us, isn't he? Yeah, I admitted, he really is. We sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in our own thoughts about the mess we'd created. Eventually, Mason stood up and headed for the door, looking older and more tired than when he'd arrived. I should go, he said, figure out how to apologize for all of this. Mason, I called as he reached for the handle. For what it's worth, I'm sorry too. About using him, about letting my feelings for you get in the way of treating him fairly. He nodded without turning around. We really screwed this up, didn't we? Completely, I agreed. After he left, I stood in my empty apartment, wondering how something that had started as simple revenge had become so complicated. Jaxon deserved better than being caught between two people who couldn't figure out their own emotions without hurting everyone around them. The question now was whether any of us could find a way forward that didn't end in more pain and broken hearts. 2 days of radio silence followed the confrontation, until finally Jaxon's text arrived, but it wasn't what I expected. Mason had been calling and texting non-stop, even showing up in my building's lobby to wait for me like some kind of determined stalker. His guilt trip was in full swing, complete with long voicemails about how sorry he was and how we needed to talk. But Jaxon, complete ghost mode. His silence was somehow louder than all of Mason's desperate attempts at communication combined. I spent those 2 days sorting through the mess of my feelings, forcing myself to confront some uncomfortable truths. The reality was that I had been using Jaxon initially. Revenge against Mason had felt sweet when I could make his boyfriend laugh, when I could witness Mason's growing insecurity and jealousy. But somewhere between poetry discussions and stolen glances across cafe tables, Jaxon had become more than just a weapon in my emotional arsenal. He'd become someone I genuinely cared about, someone whose happiness mattered to me independent of how it affected Mason. So when Jaxon's text finally came, the message caught me completely off guard. Meet me at Riverside Park. We need to talk. All three of us. All three of us. That was unexpected and slightly terrifying. I arrived at the park 15 minutes early, needing time to prepare myself for whatever conversation awaited. Mason was already there, sitting on what used to be our bench, during happier times, looking absolutely miserable and sleep-deprived. His usual perfect appearance was disheveled. Wrinkled clothes, unwashed hair, dark circles under his eyes that suggested he'd been having as much trouble sleeping as I had. I approached hesitantly, still processing why Jaxon had summoned both of us here. Mason looked up when I sat down, offering a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Any idea what this is about?" he asked quietly. "None whatsoever," I admitted. "But knowing Jaxon, he's probably been thinking through every angle of this situation." Jaxon arrived exactly on time, his expression unreadable but determined. He'd clearly spent the past few days not just thinking but planning, and something about his purposeful stride suggested he'd reached some kind of conclusion about our complicated triangle. "I've been reflecting," Jaxon began, choosing to stand rather than sit with us, "about this entire situation, the jealousy, the manipulation, the hurt feelings, but also the genuine connections between all of us. And I have a proposal." Mason and I exchanged confused glances. A proposal? That could mean anything from "let's all be mature adults and move on" to something far more complex. "What if," Jaxon continued, taking a deep breath that suggested he was about to say something significant, "instead of continuing to fight over who gets whom, we acknowledge that human emotions are complicated, that maybe traditional dating rules and societal expectations don't apply to every situation." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Mason asked carefully, though I could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to anticipate where this was going. "I'm suggesting," Jackson's voice grew stronger and more confident, "that maybe I don't want to choose between you two. Maybe neither of you really wants to choose either." My brain completely short-circuited. Was he saying what I thought he was saying? "You mean," I started, unable to finish the sentence. "I mean polyamory. All three of us, together. If we can figure out how to make it work without destroying each other in the process." Mason looked like he'd been physically slapped. "Are you completely insane?" "Am I?" Jaxon challenged, settling cross-legged on the grass in front of our bench, looking up at both of us with those intense storm-gray eyes. "Mason, you're still clearly in love with Dennis. Your jealousy and possessiveness prove it. Dennis, you have feelings for both of us now, whether you want to admit it or not. And me? I've discovered that I care about both of you in different ways, but equally genuinely." The silence that followed stretched between us like a rubber band ready to snap. Cars passed on the nearby street. Joggers ran by on the path. Families played with their children on the playground. Normal people living normal lives, while we sat here discussing the possibility of rewriting every relationship rule we'd ever known. The crazy part was that Jaxon wasn't completely wrong. Somewhere in this chaotic mess, I had developed real feelings for both of them. My love for Mason was complicated by our history, familiar and comfortable but also tainted by past hurt and manipulation. My feelings for Jaxon were newer, electric and exciting, built on intellectual connection and genuine compatibility. "This is absolutely crazy," Mason whispered, but his tone wasn't dismissive. If anything, he sounded thoughtful, like he was seriously considering the possibility. "Crazy enough to actually work?" Jaxon asked, hope creeping into his voice as his eyes moved between Mason and me, searching our faces for any sign of receptiveness to his radical suggestion. I found myself thinking about the past few weeks, how natural it had felt talking with Jaxon, how right it seemed when the three of us were together despite the underlying tension. Maybe conventional relationships hadn't worked for us because we weren't conventional people. I started, then stopped, unsure how to articulate the thoughts swirling through my mind. "I don't know if I even know how that would work." "None of us do," Jaxon admitted. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can figure it out together, make our own rules instead of trying to fit into boxes that don't suit us." Mason was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands as he processed this unexpected turn. When he finally looked up, his expression was vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen since our early dating days. "You really think this could work?" he asked Jaxon. "All three of us?" "I think," Jaxon said carefully, "that what we have right now isn't working. The jealousy, the manipulation, the hurt feelings, none of that is sustainable. But the underlying connections are real. Maybe instead of fighting them, we should explore them." The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. It would mean confronting every insecurity, every possessive instinct, every societal expectation about how relationships should work. But it would also mean not having to choose, not having to give up either connection that had come to matter so much. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jaxon smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from him since the confrontation in my apartment. "Now we decide if we're brave enough to try something completely unprecedented. Together." Mason reached for my hand, then for Jackson's, linking the three of us in a circle that felt both fragile and strong. "I guess," he said with a shaky laugh, "we're about to find out if three really can be better than two." Looking at both of them, Mason with his familiar intensity and Jaxon with his calm wisdom, I realized that maybe the most unconventional solution was exactly what our unconventional situation required. 3 weeks later, we were still figuring out the logistics. But surprisingly, it was actually working. Awkward? Absolutely. Especially during those first mornings when all three of us would share coffee in Mason's spacious apartment, still learning each other's rhythms and navigating the strange new dynamics of our expanded relationship. I discovered that Jaxon was grumpy before his first cup of coffee, that Mason hogged the bathroom for a ridiculous amount of time, and that I apparently talked too much when I was nervous, which was constantly during those early days. But it was also surprisingly natural in ways I hadn't expected. Mason's intense energy was balanced by Jackson's calm presence. My history with Mason provided comfort and familiarity, while my growing connection with Jaxon brought excitement and discovery. We were three very different people who somehow fit together like puzzle pieces that seemed wrong until you stepped back and saw the complete picture. Mason's insecurities still surfaced regularly, especially during late-night conversations when Jaxon and I would get deep into discussions about poetry and literature. I'd catch him watching us with a mixture of fascination and jealousy, like he couldn't decide if he was threatened by our intellectual connection or impressed by it. But we were learning to address those moments head-on instead of letting them fester into bigger problems. And me? I was still learning how to love two people differently, but equally how to give Mason the reassurance and attention he craved while also nurturing the quieter, more contemplative bond I shared with Jaxon. "All right, ground rules meeting," Mason announced one evening over dinner, pulling out his phone with what appeared to be an extensive notes app. "We need to establish clear boundaries if this is going to work long-term." Jaxon smirked, reaching across the table to steal a bite from Mason's plate, a casual intimacy that would have triggered World War III a month ago, but now just made Mason swat his hand playfully. "In your obsessive organizational skills." "No, he's absolutely right," I agreed, surprising myself with how readily I supported Mason's structured approach. "This only works if we communicate about everything. No more secrets, no more games, no more assuming we know what the others are thinking." We spent the next 3 hours at Mason's dining room table, laying out everything that had been on our minds. We talked about jealousy, how to recognize it, address it, and work through it without tearing each other apart. We discussed time management, making sure no one felt neglected or like they were getting less attention than they needed. We covered public appearances, how to handle friends, family, and society's inevitable judgment about our unconventional arrangement. Most importantly, we talked about the future, what this relationship looked like in 5 years, whether we wanted to live together, how we'd handle major life decisions as a trio instead of a couple. "I never thought I'd be in a throuple," Jaxon laughed, reaching across the table to take both of our hands in his. "But here we are, making relationship spreadsheets and discussing domestic logistics." Mason squeezed Jackson's hand, then mine, his expression soft with something that looked like wonder. "It still feels surreal sometimes. Like, are we actually doing this? Are we actually making this work?" The truth was, it was working better than any of us had expected. We'd developed routines that accommodated all three personalities and needs. Tuesday nights were designated for Mason and me to work through lingering issues from our past relationship. Thursday evenings belonged to Jaxon and me for our poetry discussions and quiet conversations. Weekends were for all three of us together. Movies, dinners, lazy mornings that stretched into afternoon. We learned to navigate the practical challenges too. Mason's apartment became our unofficial headquarters since it was the largest, but we made sure everyone had their own space and privacy when needed. We established protocols for making decisions, from what to have for dinner to bigger life choices that affected all of us. The hardest part was dealing with other people's reactions. Friends were confused. Family members were concerned, and strangers sometimes stared when we went out together, but we developed a united front, supporting each other through awkward questions and unsolicited advice about how relationships should work. "You know what's funny?" I said one evening, looking at both of them in the soft candlelight of Mason's dining room. "Mason, you tried to make me jealous by dating Jaxon. And it worked, just not the way you expected it to." Mason blushed, ducking his head in embarrassment. "Best backfire in relationship history?" "Definitely," Jaxon agreed, leaning over to kiss Mason's cheek and then mine. "Though I have to say, I'm grateful that both of you are apparently terrible at conventional relationships. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be in a polyamorous relationship with my manipulative ex-boyfriend and his former boyfriend, I would have recommended they seek professional help. But love, it turns out, isn't always conventional or predictable. Sometimes it's messy and complicated, and requires completely rewriting all the rules you thought you understood about how relationships should function. Sometimes the best love story is the one you never saw coming. The one that forces you to grow and change and question everything you thought you knew about yourself and what you wanted from life." We still had challenges to work through. Mason's tendency toward manipulation hadn't disappeared overnight, though he was actively working on recognizing and changing those patterns. Jaxon sometimes felt caught between our shared history and his desire to create something new. And I was still learning to trust that I could have both relationships without having to choose or sacrifice one for the other. But we were committed to figuring it out together, to creating something that worked for all three of us instead of trying to force ourselves into traditional relationship models that clearly didn't suit our particular situation. "So," Mason said as we finished cleaning up from dinner, "what's the verdict? Are we officially the most unconventional throuple in the city?" "Probably," Jaxon replied, wrapping his arms around both of us. "But I wouldn't have it any other way." Looking at them, Mason with his familiar intensity now tempered by genuine effort to be better, Jaxon with his quiet wisdom and endless patience for our emotional chaos, I realized that sometimes the most unexpected endings are the most perfect ones. Sometimes everyone gets to win, even when winning looks nothing like what you originally planned. Sometimes 3 broken pieces can create something stronger and more beautiful than any of them could have been alone. And sometimes, just sometimes, the love story that starts with jealousy and manipulation can evolve into something real and lasting and worth all the complicated work it requires. 6 months later, we're still figuring it out, still learning and growing and occasionally driving each other crazy. But we're doing it together, and that makes all the difference in the world.